Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Econ Thought, the podcast and interview series of the Society for Professional Economists here in London. So today we are kind of joined by Marian Tupy from Washington, D.C. He's the founder and editor of Human Progress and a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He's also the author with Gary Pooley of Superabundance, a book that I read very quickly, is very engaging, and also lift up your spirit a little bit and make you start thinking in positive terms. So I'll definitely recommend it to everyone. And we will put the link in the show notes once it goes onto the website. Welcome, Marian.
Thank you very much for having me.
With Marian today, we want to discuss the issue around prosperity and progress. Are we achieving them? How do we maintain them if we have them already? And how do we change the conversation around them? In particular, how do we become a little bit more positive oriented? Do we need a different framework to measure actually progress and prosperity? Do we need different metrics? And we'll definitely talk a little bit about kind of the Simon Index, the Abundance Index that Marian has been working on and maintains now. But before we get started into discussion, Marian, why don't you introduce a little bit about yourself and talk about your background? How do you get where you are today?
Well, thank you. I was born in communist Czechoslovakia, grew up behind the Iron Curtain. When I was a teenager, me and my parents, we went to South Africa, where I went to high school and to college. And then I went to Britain, where I went to St. Andrews University to do my postgraduate studies. And it was in St. Andrews as a student that I got involved with many of the classical liberal/libertarian causes in Britain, including the Institute for Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, and so forth. And so I was always interested in sort of economic development. Why are some countries rich? Why are some countries poor? I was always interested in economic history, reading from ancient texts, trying to deduce what living standards were then and compare them to today. And then eventually I ended up at the Cato Institute here in Washington, D.C., where I started working in 2022. And originally I started working on economic development in sub-Saharan Africa and also on transition of ex-communist countries from communism to capitalism. And I published a bunch of op-eds, a bunch of policy studies. I ended up testifying before the US Congress. And eventually, about 10 years ago, I read Matt Ridley's great book, The Rational Optimist, and that inspired me to start humanprogress.org, which is basically a website that is devoted to documenting and promoting the idea of human progress.
Thank you. That's wonderful. In fact, again, recommend definitely to go onto the website as well. There is a lot of data and visual kind of representation as well of data, which is great actually to have. But before we get into a discussion around the way you've been looking at human progress, the metrics and the index that you use, and also look at some of your research, I want to start the conversation today with a story about a bet. And not necessarily because I'm a betting man myself, though I've been partial to some betting in the past in my youth, maybe misspent youth, maybe there was a little bit too much today, not today at the moment. But also because it's a story about, in my view, about progress and also the optimism that you mentioned that it was in the book from Matt Ridley. And in a bet between Paul Ehrlich from the Population Bomb that he wrote back in the 70s and Julian Simon, but maybe a kind of Martin. Why don't I leave it to you actually to explain a little bit of that story?
Sure, it is a long story. I'll try to be as quick as possible. Since the end of the Second World War, population growth became a very, very important subject to talk about because the population in Asia especially started growing very, very fast, and then eventually Africa. And there were a lot of people who were concerned that we were going to have far too many people in the world and not enough resources for them. And really, the most important person who emerged after the Second World War was Paul Ehrlich, who is still alive. He's 92 or 93. He's a biologist from Stanford University. And in 1968, he published a very famous book called The Population Bomb, sold millions of copies, translated in God knows how many languages, and it really freaked out the entire globe into believing that we were just going to have too many people. The more people you have, the thinner the slices of pizza must get, right? Because we have finite resources. And he became a star, international star. He was on Johnny Carson's show, which was the most popular nightly talk show in the United States for decades. And people took him seriously. It was based on his work and the work of Club of Rome, and things like that. That the Chinese have finally instituted the one-child policy in 1980, with far-reaching consequences to today. And basically, Paul was saying things which were dramatic, and it turned out completely wrong. He was not only saying that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the 1970s and the 1980s because of lack of food. He was saying that Britain would be underwater by the year 2000. He was advocating for putting fertility depressants in water system and things like that. So he was a doomer all around. And over here in Washington and Maryland, my precursor here at Cato, Julian Simon, who was a senior fellow here and also a professor of economics at University of Maryland, was looking at the same numbers that Paul Ehrlich was looking at and saying, I think the truth is the exact opposite. I'm looking at the prices of commodities, and it seems that they are actually trending down, even though population is increasing. So they were sort of sniping at each other throughout the 1970s, with Paul being very, very ad hominem, accusing Simon of being a moron and things like that. But eventually, Ehrlich accepted a bet, which started in 1980. According to the terms of the bet, Paul chose 5 metals: chromium, tungsten, tin, copper, and one more, which I always forget, and nickel, I think. And they made a futures contract for $1,000 if in 10 years' time, which in 1990 commodities went down in price, Ehrlich would pay Simon, and if they went up in price, then Simon would pay Ehrlich. And when the bet came to an end in 1990, the average price of the commodities adjusted for inflation fell by 36%, even though the population of the world added 800 million more people. And so this was a very important bet, especially within the area of economics. I think that a lot of economists were always suspicious of Paul Ehrlich and Malthusianism. A lot of economists, we must give the economics discipline a credit, but a lot of economists were not. But after 1990, I think within the economics discipline, this sort of thing sort of went away. And very few people talked about overpopulation. In fact, it is in the 1990s that you get people like Kramer, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, actually crediting population growth with prosperity. And more recently, you have people like Charles Jones over in California also arguing that there is a link between population and prosperity. The more people you have, the more innovations, ideas you have, and so on. So why write this book if economists are already more or less united around the idea that people are important? And that is because public opinion and media is 20 or 30 years behind the specialists, behind the economics discipline. You talk to any ordinary human being who hasn't read anything on this except what they have received from the media, and everybody is basically Malthusian. And I think there are completely understandable evolutionary reasons for why that should be so. I mean, our species is about 300,000 years old, and for most of that time, life really was a zero-sum game. You know, the more somebody else had in your group and they didn't share it with you, the less you had. Or if your band got more, some other band of people was starving. So we have evolved to have this deeply ingrained zero-sum psychological attitude. And so even though the economists now are on the right page, the general public and the media is still very much Malthusian in orientation.
Yeah, and so then you wrote a book, obviously, Preabundance, but also a lot of your research, and obviously in there you talk a little bit, as you said, about the connection between the number of people, the number of ideas, and the number of innovation, which is, you know, again, once expressed in that way, seems kind of relatively straightforward as well. The more brains you have, the more likely that actually the more the brains will come up with an idea and therefore more innovation. But then how do you then measure that? And I think is another kind of additional element that introduce in your kind of research as well. How do you then prove that the prosperity and actually that has increased over time?
Yes, there was one very important component which I forgot to mention in my previous answer, and something that you alluded to in your question, and that is that um, there is a fundamental difference in between how economists think about people and how biologists think about people. It is astonishing to this day for me to see how many biologists are still Malthusian, because their conception of the world is really one based on the study of animals. You have plenty of food, animals have a lot of sex, they produce a lot of babies, they eat everything around them, population collapses. Okay. But economists have always understood, and more so in the last, I would say, 35 years, that there's a fundamental difference between animals and between humans and non-human animals, which is to say that we have reason, we have theory of mind, we have much higher levels of intelligence than even the most intelligent mammals, that we can plan ahead and so forth. And so when economists look at people, they think of not just an empty stomach, but also a pair of hands and a brain capable of producing new ideas. So the linkage is very important because not everybody innovates. You see, if innovation was something that we could stimulate or knew how to produce more innovators, people have been trying to do this for a very long time with very mixed results. And in fact, I would submit that the literature on this is not entirely positive. In other words, whether we can actually stimulate innovation. Innovation just comes from some people. It comes from people that we usually don't suspect or have no reason to suspect. Very few people actually partake in innovation, maybe 5% of the population. And so the bigger number of people you have, the bigger the absolute number of people that you will end up having being innovators, even if the fraction or even if the percentage stays the same. And I suspect that the percentage actually remains the same. And so then the question arose, okay, we want the book to be as convincing as possible, which means that let's go back in time as far as possible. Let's gather data on the prices of resources going back as far as possible. And in our case, that was to 1850. Maybe other people have other data sets that we are not aware of that go further, but we found a couple that went back to 1850. Okay, well, when you are dealing with that kind of time period, 1850 to 2018 or 2020, what do you do about currencies? Some currencies are no longer around. Inflation rates, estimation of inflation rates, and exchange rates. How do you do that? And then we chanced upon the idea of time prices, basically not measuring the price of resources in terms of dollars and cents or pounds and shillings and pennies, but in terms of how long it takes you to work in order to earn enough money to buy something, right? Because an hour of work is the same in 2024 as it was in 1900. It's the same in China as it is in the United States. And so we are taking all the noise out of it, including inflation. We are just comparing nominal price of a commodity and the nominal wage, hourly wage at the time of the purchase at the start of the analysis, and then we repeat the process at the end of the analysis. And instead of using dollars and cents, we just use minutes and hours of work. So if today it takes you an hour of work in order to buy a pound of beef, but in 10 years' time, it takes you half an hour of work to buy a pound of beef, then you're twice as well off.
And you take, in terms of measuring that nominal wage, for example, obviously the wages are different people across the population. Do you take the mean, the median? How do you ensure that kind of you're measuring the same person, if you see what I mean?
Okay, excellent question. So for our global data, because of course we can't go granular on a global level, but for our global data, when we are looking at abundance at the level of the globe, we simply do GDP of a country divided by the number of hours worked in that country. Okay, so we get a GDP per hour worked, and then we look at what's happening at the ratios. A more granular analysis involves the United States, where we go back to 1850. And what we use there is a fabulous database from measuringworth.com, which is a website containing data used by the American Society of Economic Historians. And there we have data for skilled and unskilled laborers, blue collar workers and unskilled laborers, going back to late 1700s. So for the American analysis, we don't actually even use average, let alone we don't use median, and we don't use average. We focus specifically at the blue collar and unskilled workers, and that was deliberate choice because we didn't want our critics to come back and say, oh, you're using average data and that skews because there's a lot of economic inequality in the United States. So we say, okay, let's look at somebody who was cleaning toilets, an unskilled labor in 1850, and a person who is cleaning toilets today, unskilled labor in 2024. And let's see what happened to their standards of living. And we get the same relationships. Now, when I say we get the same relationship, that is sort of an important part of the puzzle because superabundance has a technical meaning. And that is that increasing abundance of resources should rise at a faster rate than population growth. So if population growth is 1% a year, but your abundance is growing at 1.5% a year, we call that superabundance. And in fact, in all the data sets we looked at, we came across the superabundant relationship. And that makes us think that, whether you're looking at the globe or whether you're looking at the United States specifically, these relationships hold.
Yeah. And then what was the kind of the outcome? What of your analysis, your research, what do you see in the data in terms of that kind of time price? How does it grow over time? Give a little bit of a flavor, and also any differences across history as well in terms of there has been a particular period of history when that kind of level of progress has accelerated and which part of history has slowed down. And then we can talk a little bit about what's coming next in the future as well.
Correct. So on your second question first, I believe it's chapter 7, where we calculate the rates of growth in superabundance. And what we find is that in recent times, they've been accelerating rather than decelerating. So when we first started thinking about this book, people still thought about the great stagnation or the great down and things like that. And, economists were sort of in a funk thinking that innovation is stopping or slowing, etc. In superabundance, we found that in more recent decades, the rate of growth has actually increased. So whereas in the 1800s and the early 1900s, we were still finding growth rates of about 2.5%. By the time that you get to the end of the last millennium and the beginning of this millennium, we are talking about growth rates of about 3.5%. So actually, it seems to be accelerating, right? I mean, as you would expect, if you're looking like we do at food and minerals, etc., as agricultural techniques and mining techniques improve, we simply get at more stuff, right? So that's one of the reasons. Now, your first question was, please remind me, your first
and
part.
it was more about the trend. So you kind of outlined already about the trends over time in terms of whether you kind of you had more or less growth in the few decades, and you said that it actually increased.
It seemed to be accelerating. Yeah.
And what kind of is the primary reason for that difference between the normal perception? Or if I look at GDP growth, and obviously that's where the perception comes from, because I assume that in 2010s or even in the kind of 1970s, 80s, probably slower growth than the golden age everybody talk about, which is the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. But if instead, from the superabundance kind of index point of view, it's been accelerating, there is a kind of a discrepancy between the two metrics. What drives the discrepancy primarily?
Well, in a way, because of course time price combines both the growth in wages and also the growth in abundance of resources. So if you are just measuring productivity gains in, let's say, wheat yields per acre of land, okay, so let's say that you have a 2% increase in abundance of wheat yields per acre of land per year. I'm making up these numbers, but let's assume that. Well, that goes into the productivity statistic, but at the same time, your wages may have increased by 1 or 2% at the same time. So really, there are two sets of productivity gains going on at the same time in delivery of the services and the goods, and then also in the incomes that people make, right? And so time prices really put that together.
Yeah.
I mean, I leave it up to you and people smarter than me to figure out whether this is an appropriate way of doing it. It's a different way of doing
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
We still think that it's a meaningful way of doing it, because what you want is to figure out, is life getting better?
yeah.
Well, for the things that we measure, unambiguously so. Now, there are limits to time prices that I should mention because they're important. And that is that time prices work the best for when you're comparing like with like. So if you're comparing a pound of butter today with a pound of butter in 1850, you can do a good time price analysis, or beef or oranges or bananas or nickel or copper or oil or whatever, because those things don't change. But when it comes to, adjusting for this, whatever it is, 13 versus number one, that's time prices have similar difficulties as GDP and all sorts of other prices. So for what we are trying to do, which is to say, look at, first of all, the role of population growth, two, the role of innovation, and looking at commodities that don't change over time, then time prices strike us as the best and also the easiest way of doing it.
Yeah. And is there any difference between, if you look at services versus goods? Because I might think that for goods, there might be a much improvement in terms of
Yes,
things
very
are getting
important question.
cheaper. But in services, there may be less actually, inverted comma, productivity increase potentially, or at least the price have gone down relatively less. And therefore, from a time price perspective, the progress has been kind of less than for goods.
Yes, so that partly accounts for what some economists call the Baumol effect, where wages increase even in unproductive sectors, and also the fact that the more human labor goes into something, then you would, and as the price of labor increases, as it does. In fact, that was one of our biggest insights, is that the one thing that consistently gets more expensive over time is actually human labor. It's actually incredible. It's not gold. It's human labor. Anyway, so complicated picture. I'm going to talk about the United States because that's what I know best. It is unquestionably true that whereas food, electronics, furnishings, clothing, etc., have become substantially cheaper, education and healthcare have become much more expensive, and childcare, right? I will note that in all of these areas, it's what the government considers to be a basic human right, and it's heavily regulated and heavily subsidized. Now, I'm talking to economists, so you will understand that if you subsidize something, it's going to increase in price. You understand it. Our politicians don't seem to understand it. Certainly, the public doesn't understand it. And so if you, for example, a sickly person in the United States, then it's not all that relevant that food has collapsed in price. What's important for you is that healthcare has become much more expensive. So in order to so we acknowledge that abundance is not increasing everywhere, but we did try to do one thing in order to ascertain what would happen if a service was allowed to be subjected to normal market forces. And we looked at the prices of cosmetic surgery. We looked at, I believe it's 14 different types of cosmetic surgery over a period of 30 years, and they all grew in abundance at a superabundant rate, meaning they are collapsing in price. So if you can draw, and it's debatable whether you can draw a direct line or direct analogy between normal healthcare costs and cosmetic surgery costs, although you still have nurses, you still have doctors, you still have administrative costs, you still have hospital costs, you still have anesthesia. But basically, subjected to proper market forces, cosmetic surgery is becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Now, we are not saying that if market forces had a role to play in the delivery of American healthcare, that we would get superabundance. But we would get we conjecture from our findings that we would certainly have lower increase in scarcity and greater increases in abundance.
Yeah. And in a sense, I think it has been kind of shown that wherever actually there's been more kind of regulation to a certain extent, the prices is that's the areas where the prices have gone down a little bit.
90 cents of every dollar. People in Europe and elsewhere, they have a very skewed, or rather, they have an outdated view. Again, being 20 years behind times about how healthcare operates in the United States. 90 cents out of every dollar spent on healthcare in the United States is now spent by third parties, meaning that people don't pay for it out of pocket in the way that they do with elective surgery, like cosmetic surgery. They're paid. The market forces don't apply. It's either the government that pays or insurers that pay, etc.
Yeah. And now, kind of trying to look at it's difficult to look at the crystal ball actually, and looking in the future. Based on past trends and current policy in place, so forces, macroeconomic or microeconomic forces that you see at play at the moment, do you expect that kind of the time prices that have been declining to continue to decline? And then, or actually, do you see at some point an inflection point? Are we reaching a point over which kind of you can't actually reduce anymore? So any expectation of where the direction of travel might be going in the future?
Well, if economists like Brian Kaplan and Robin Hanson and Charles James are correct, then in the absence of artificial general intelligence, after the world peaks in population, after maybe 2060s, you could get into trouble whereby world population starts shrinking, and possibly even at a fast rate, because every new estimation of global population is getting lower and lower and lower by 2100. So you could have a dramatic decline in the number of innovations and people actually working on research projects and so forth, because simply there are going to be fewer people in the world, especially in countries on the frontier of innovation. The United States, South Korea, 0.7 children per woman per lifetime, right? Europe, you could compensate for it with immigration, for better and for worse. Alternatively, what could happen is that other countries reach the frontier of innovation, like South Korea did, and Taiwan in the 1970s and 1980s. And maybe AI will come to our rescue. Now, I'm overwhelmed on a daily basis. I'm signed up to a bunch of newsletters and science journals and so on. I'm overwhelmed on a daily basis how you cannot open an email without finding out something unbelievable happening in the world, such as, for example, just today, CRISPR has developed plants that can grow underground. They don't need light. Big deal if you are, if you are, living in a country without good electricity supply and things like that. So things are changing. It seems to me that we have overcome that hump that economists saw of sort of sluggish growth. I think that we could well be at a start of a new growth spurt that could dramatically change the world for the better.
Yeah. So you're a techno optimist, basically.
I am. I'm not just rationally optimistic about the future, but I'm also techno optimistic. I think that it's really the coming together of different technologies that gives me tremendous hope for the future. Robotics are getting marvelous combined with AI. The sky's the limit.
Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting. Another way, because there has been a lot of policies, thinking about fertility, for example, there has been a lot of countries that are trying to introduce policy to increase fertility and change the trend, and therefore kind of stop the decline in population. And I was just listening to a couple of kind of interviews in the last few days, and pretty much all of them, one way or another, they have failed or they have not actually achieved the desired outcome. So one of the way the policy could change, for example, is think is slightly different, not necessarily in terms of number of people heads, but the number of years that a person work. And for example, if you say that a person works between the age of, for the sake of argument, 18 and 62, then you go 44 years.
Is that when you retire in Britain at 62?
No, I just say a certain country, let's say 67. That's the age in the United Kingdom. So let's say put it that way. So let's say you got 50 years where actually you work.
Yeah.
If through improvement in healthcare, which where actually artificial intelligence, some of the other digital technology might help, Now, suddenly I'm kind of actively working and I can productively working for, let's say, 70 years rather than 50. In a sense, I have more time to make discovery, innovation, and ideas, in which case, even if the population declines, which based on what we discussed earlier on, it might mean that suddenly kind of therefore the number of ideas is less, and therefore productivity and innovation might be less. But because people live longer and they are more productive for longer, I might, to a certain extent, slow that decline or potentially kind of invert it. Is that something that you had looked at in terms of the number of years a person is productive in addition to just the number of heads?
No, partly because I'm aware of a bunch of studies suggesting that innovations tend to happen early in the lives of scientists and engineers and physicists and so forth. Um, it seems that the older you get, the more conservative you get also in your ideas. You are set in you're path dependent in certain ways. For example, Einstein lived to ripe old age, but he was going in the wrong directions in terms of certain physical discoveries, because he had developed a set of preconceptions when he was a younger man, and simply couldn't then deviate from it. Um, so path dependency in thinking is also important, and the older we get, the less adventurous we get, the more conservative we get, and also in our thinking. So that's what I've seen. I mean, I this is not really my specialty, so I don't really know whether that research has been corroborated, but as far as I know, it has. Or whether that research is solid, but as far as I know, it is. But just keeping people employed is not just good for, it's good not just for the economy, because obviously you don't want to have your population of working population collapse, but it seems that work is actually quite important to people, keeping people sharp and giving them something to do, keeping people mentally engaged and giving them meaning. In the old days, 20 years ago, I was a huge fan of the universal basic income. And I've changed my mind on it, not because I don't think it can't work. Maybe it could be made to work, but I think that work is more important than just earning money. It's also an important sense of meaning in one's life, and that's especially true in an increasingly secularizing age. And an increasingly childless age. So if you don't have children, if you don't have God in your life, then maybe work is something that can actually compensate it somewhat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've been a number of kind of books and studies recently that highlight that in terms of the work and actually the life around work, which is kind of providing kind of purpose and meaning to people, which is very important. And in a sense, it might be, if I always try to see a little bit of a silver lining in there, it might actually make people potentially even more kind of productive in a sense, because you actually have a meaning. You apply yourself more productively, in which case it might actually say that as you continue to progress, you provide not only kind of economic growth, but also kind of the more kind of level of potentially inverted comma happiness and social cohesion, because people have with a purposeful life are more likely actually to interact and behave in a more social kind of way as well. So I think a number of positive elements there.
Yeah, and I mean, we certainly don't want to force people. I mean, I still think that the one thing that's even more important than economic growth is human freedom. So I don't want to force people to stay in jobs that they don't want to do, but we should certainly remove whatever barriers there are to people to stay longer in jobs if they want to. And who knows, maybe the culture can change in a sense that people will start appreciating work more, and maybe they will start even appreciating children more, because the book is really written to remind people that children are not just a carbon footprint, that that children are a source of innovation, they are a source of joy and source of happiness. So I think that culture plays somewhat a role in how we perceive childbirths and so forth. I think that opportunity cost matters clearly. Women who decide to go into careers then have less time to have children. So whatever way we can to remove the barriers to people having kids, we should do that, certainly. Whether children should be subsidized, I know that's something that people like Robin are open to. I think that even Robin Hansen would acknowledge that if we are going to go down that route, it's going to be incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's feasible in a country like the United States, where we already run $1.5 trillion deficits every year. Now because it would be expensive. When women can earn $75,000, $100,000 on average in the United States, being in the workplace, it will be very expensive to compensate them for it. And as you said, I don't see any evidence that people elsewhere, like in Hungary, for example, are successful. In Hungary, it has increased marriage rates a little bit, but not necessarily child birth rates. And we are still waiting for data and analysis of Israel, because that's what really matters here. Israel is a sophisticated first world democracy, advanced country, and that's where not just the Orthodox but also secular Jews have more children than is the replacement rate. And so I know a number of people who are looking into this and trying to figure out what is it exactly that makes Israel special.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a topic that has come up quite a lot recently as well, particularly as the curve of decline actually is going down. And before we end this kind of great conversation that we had, just a quick couple of points on in terms of policy, kind of anything from your side that you see that make you kind of more positive about the direction of the future, and things that instead will make you a little bit less, when it comes in particular around the topic that you discuss and cover a lot about liberty and prosperity. Is there any particular policy that you will say, oh, that is a good positive trend that I can see that we should reinforce, and something that maybe we should stop?
Let me put it slightly differently and in a kind of shocking way. In a way, I think China is going to save us. And that is because...
That's definitely potentially a controversial kind of statement.
Yeah. Americans can unite around threats.
Mm-hmm.
If AI came on board 20 years ago, when America was at the height of its power and unchallenged hegemon in the world, I could well see the political consensus forming around banning it because of all the uncertainties. But now that we know that China is working on it, I don't think that AI can be banned, and I don't think that because the obvious response is, okay, if we are not going to get it, China is going to get it.
Yeah.
And AI right now is the biggest game in town in terms of not just productivity gains, but also the potential for actually innovating in the future, right? So assuming that we can get to the artificial general intelligence, then we could get to a point where it gets so smart that it can come up with its own ideas. Certainly right now, there's huge promise in healthcare and education and so forth. Anyway, my point is that under normal circumstances, you would expect something like that to be strangled in its cradle by the status quo powers, by risk-averse people, by the political system. But because we have China on the horizon, basically pouring billions into this, I think that AI, I hope that AI doesn't get canceled here in the United States. And it's the biggest game in town. So that's what gives me some optimism. Okay,
that's good. That's a good way to end the conversation on a positive note, independent of where actually the origin of that positive note comes from, in which case a little bit of a threat or a competitive threat. Let's put it this way.
Well, interjurisdictional competition has been incredibly important in the rise of Europe after 1500, and it will remain into the future, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a sense, the division of actually a lot of multiple principalities in the 16th, 17th, 18th century actually definitely helped Europe actually kind of sprint ahead. Marian, it's been fantastic having you on our podcast, and thank you so much for your time. And I will definitely kind of put the links to your work and the ones that we mentioned today on the show notes. And I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a good day. Bye.